President Trump now says he could temporarily withdraw Todd Blanche's nomination to become Attorney General on a permanent basis. That's after Republicans delayed a vote amid concerns from two key GOP senators about two elements of President Trump's settlement with the IRS. One is the so-called anti-weaponization fund that could have seen the Department of Justice pay out millions to Trump allies. The other is the scope of Trump's immunity from IRS audits in the agreement. Our Christiane Cordero joins us now from Washington. Christiane, good to see you. What's the latest you're hearing about this?
Well, James, this is essentially an attempt to break that standoff that's happening between those two GOP senators that you mentioned and the administration itself. Senators Thom Tillis and John Cornyn are basically holding their votes and disrupting the process in exchange for what they want to see, those stipulations that you mentioned regarding the $1.8 roughly billion IRS settlement that goes towards political allies, and also the conditions that were settled outside of that.
All right. Adam again back with something you'll like. On January 3, 2026, Trump's legal defense imploded in open court in a chaotic, unprecedented meltdown captured on audio and video. The humiliation was so complete that even loyal supporters struggled to defend him. Trump's lead attorneys, Boris Epshteyn and Todd Blanche, two of the most trusted and experienced lawyers in Trump's legal operation, did something that lawyers almost never do. They stood up in open court during an active hearing and filed an emergency motion to withdraw from representing Trump. This was not a quiet, behind-the-scenes resignation that could be managed discreetly. This was a public abandonment that sent shockwaves through the legal community and the political world. Lawyers have a professional obligation to stick with their clients through difficult cases. It is considered deeply unprofessional to abandon a client in the middle of legal proceedings. But Epshteyn and Blanche had reached a breaking point. They were so fed up with Trump's behavior, so exhausted by his outbursts and his refusal to follow legal advice, that they were willing to face professional consequences just to get away from him.
We have breaking news involving the president's embattled pick for Attorney General Todd Blanche. Trump now says he may just bail on the whole thing and pull Blanche's nomination for the time being because of two Republican holdouts. He fired off this lengthy post a short time ago. Quote, Todd Blanche is a star, and everyone knows it. He has the potential to go down as one of the greatest attorney generals of all time. However, John Cornyn of Texas and Thom Tillis of North Carolina, both of whom I refuse to endorse and whose political careers have been ended by my action, are refusing to vote for this great nominee who will remain in any event as acting. I have no obligation to temporarily withdrawing Todd's name if they do not do the right thing and putting him back after Cornyn and Tillis are out of office. Blanche's bid to get Senate confirmation was collapsing because he won't give Cornyn and Tillis what they want. Definitive proof in writing that the president's so-called anti-weaponization fund is in fact dead, and that the sweeping Trump IRS immunity deal attached to it is pared back.
When the judge asked them to explain why they were filing this extraordinary motion, Epshteyn and Blanche delivered testimony that was absolutely devastating for Trump. They said they could no longer effectively represent this client because Trump was impossible to work with. They said Trump would not listen to legal advice, that he kept making statements that contradicted their legal positions, that he undermined their defense strategies with his public outbursts, and that he was verbally abusive to them. This admission, coming from Trump's own lawyers in open court, was catastrophic for Trump's legal position. It was essentially Trump's own attorneys telling the world that their client was so difficult, so unreasonable, and so self-destructive that they could not ethically continue representing him. That is not a statement that lawyers make lightly. That is a statement they only make when they have truly exhausted every other option. Trump's reaction to this development only made things infinitely worse. When he heard his lawyers asking to withdraw, Trump stood up in the courtroom and started yelling. He screamed, "You're fired!" at his own lawyers, as if he was the one ending the relationship, as if he was still in control of the situation. But everyone in that courtroom could see the reality of what was happening.
President Trump says he may withdraw and delay Todd Blanche's nomination for Attorney General until Senators Cornyn and Tillis leave office. Both senators have demanded additional assurances in writing that the, quote, anti-weaponization fund is dead, and have pressed for clarification on the scope of a tax immunity deal that the president secured by suing the IRS. The Senate Judiciary Committee on Thursday postponed a planned vote to advance Blanche's nomination. And just minutes ago, we actually heard from President Trump on Truth Social as he fired back against John Cornyn. Look, he said, John Cornyn never had a problem with the so-called fund, which will not benefit me, but rather the great American patriots who were hunted down like dogs and whose lives were unfairly and illegally destroyed by the crooked Joe Biden administration until after I decided to endorse and support his Republican primary opponent in Texas, who easily won the nomination for the U.S. Senate.
Trump's lawyers weren't being fired. They were quitting. They were abandoning Trump because he was simply too difficult to represent. Trump's desperate attempt to save face by pretending he was firing them just made him look weak, pathetic, and completely detached from reality. The courtroom marshals had to move toward Trump to try to get him to sit down. The judge was banging the gavel demanding order. Trump's remaining legal team members were trying to physically restrain him. It was absolute chaos, and the entire scene was captured on courtroom audio and video. The footage leaked immediately and went viral within hours. Millions of people watched Trump having a complete meltdown in court. They watched his lawyers abandoning him. They watched him screaming and pointing fingers like he was on a reality TV show instead of in a federal courtroom facing serious legal consequences. This became one more piece of evidence that Trump's presidency and his life were falling apart, and the contrast between Trump's behavior and the calm professionalism of his former lawyers could not have been more stark. Epstein and Blanche looked like responsible attorneys who had done everything they could to help their client and had finally been forced to give up.
Yeah, late Sunday night, a spokesperson for Senator John Cornyn said the senator had an agreement with the Department of Justice over this agreement between President Donald Trump and the Department of Justice to settle a lawsuit. That settlement was delaying Todd Blanche's nomination for Attorney General.
Are you confident you'll be confirmed?
Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche says productive engagement led to an agreement with Senate Republicans. He's President Donald Trump's nominee to be the Senate-confirmed Attorney General.
We have a man named Todd Blanche. He's outstanding in every way.
But two Republican holdouts, Senators Thom Tillis and John Cornyn, opposed his nomination last week. That would have been enough to block Blanche's nomination in the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Trump looked like a man who was completely out of control, unable to accept reality, and desperate to pretend that he was still in charge, even as everything collapsed around him. The significance of this lawyer withdrawal cannot be overstated. Epstein and Blanche weren't just representing Trump in one case. They were coordinating his defense across numerous proceedings, criminal appeals, civil judgments, asset seizure battles, everything. They were the architects of Trump's legal strategy. They were the ones who knew the details of every case, who understood the weaknesses and strengths of Trump's position, who had built relationships with judges and opposing counsel. Losing them at this critical moment was a devastating blow to Trump's ability to defend himself. And the reasons they gave for withdrawing, that Trump was impossible to work with, that he wouldn't follow legal advice, that he made statements undermining his own defense, those reasons became part of the public record. They could be cited by prosecutors in other cases. They could be used to demonstrate a pattern of obstructive behavior. They could make judges less sympathetic to Trump's claims and less likely to give him any benefit of the doubt. What makes this situation even more remarkable is that Trump had relied on Epstein and Blanche so heavily. These were not marginal figures in Trump's legal operation. They had defended Trump in the New York criminal cases. They had been by Trump's side through trials and appeals. Trump had trusted them, made them central figures in his legal strategy. But by January 2026, the relationship had deteriorated completely. According to sources close to the legal team, Trump had become increasingly difficult to work with as his legal situations worsened. He would ignore legal advice, insist on strategies that his lawyers knew would fail, have public outbursts that contradicted what his lawyers had argued in court, and blame his lawyers when things went wrong. He would scream at them, threaten to fire them, accuse them of being incompetent or disloyal. Epstein and Blanche had apparently reached their breaking point. They could no longer represent Trump effectively because Trump was sabotaging his own defense. The January 3rd hearing was apparently the final straw. The hearing was about enforcement of one of the many judgments against Trump. His lawyers were trying to negotiate with the judge about payment schedules and asset protections. They were trying to buy Trump time, trying to minimize the immediate damage. But Trump kept interrupting, kept making statements that undermined what his lawyers were arguing. At one point, according to witnesses, Trump contradicted something Blanche had just said. Blanche had told the judge that Trump was cooperating with discovery requests, and Trump jumped up and said something like, "I'm not giving them anything. They're not entitled to my records." The judge immediately called Trump out, saying that Trump had just admitted to violating court orders. Blanche tried to walk it back, tried to say Trump was confused or speaking generally, but the damage was done. Trump's own words had proved he wasn't complying. After that exchange, Blanche and Epstein asked for a recess. They went into a private conference room and apparently had a conversation about whether they could continue representing someone who was actively sabotaging his own case. They decided they couldn't. So when the hearing resumed, Epstein stood up and addressed the judge. He said that he and Blanche were filing an emergency motion to withdraw as counsel. The judge was shocked and asked them to explain. Epstein said something to the effect of, "Your Honor, we can no longer effectively represent this client. The client won't follow legal advice. The client makes statements that contradict our legal positions, and we can no longer fulfill our ethical obligations as attorneys while representing this client." That statement was extraordinary because it was essentially saying Trump was such a bad client that his lawyers couldn't ethically continue representing him. The judge asked if this was really necessary, suggesting that maybe Epstein and Blanche should take more time to think about it because withdrawing mid-case creates huge problems. But Epstein and Blanche were adamant. They said they'd thought about it carefully and they couldn't continue. And that's when Trump erupted. He stood up and started yelling, "You're fired, both of you. I don't need you anyway." He pointed at his lawyers like he was on The Apprentice, like this was a reality TV show. Court marshals moved toward Trump to try to get him to sit down and be quiet. The judge was banging the gavel, demanding order. Trump's remaining legal team members were trying to physically restrain him, and it was absolute chaos. The whole scene was captured on video and audio, and it became one of the defining moments of Trump's presidency, a symbol of his complete and total collapse. Now, let's dig into why this lawyer withdrawal and courtroom blow-up was so significant legally and politically. It left Trump without his lead attorneys in multiple active cases. Epstein and Blanche weren't just representing Trump in one case. They were coordinating his defense across numerous proceedings. If they withdrew, Trump would need to find replacement lawyers immediately. But by January 2026, Trump was having enormous difficulty finding competent lawyers willing to represent him. Most major law firms had refused to take Trump as a client, some because of ethical concerns, some because Trump had a history of not paying legal bills, some because representing Trump had become career suicide for lawyers who wanted to maintain their reputations. The lawyers who were willing to represent Trump were often less experienced or less competent. So losing Epstein and Blanche would leave Trump with a significantly weaker legal team at exactly the moment Trump needed the strongest possible defense. The public withdrawal and the reasons given destroyed Trump's credibility. When your own lawyers say in open court that you won't follow legal advice and you make statements that undermine your own case, that's devastating. It proves you're guilty. Innocent people listen to their lawyers. Innocent people cooperate with legal processes. Guilty people sabotage their own defenses because they can't help themselves. They can't stop lying or making incriminating statements. Trump's lawyers essentially said Trump was doing exactly that, and that admission couldn't be walked back. It was on the record, part of court transcripts. Prosecutors in other cases could cite it, could point to Trump's own lawyers saying Trump was uncooperative and dishonest. That evidence made Trump's other legal situations worse. It made it harder for Trump to defend himself. It made judges less likely to give Trump any benefit of the doubt. Trump's reaction of yelling, "You're fired," showed Trump was completely detached from reality. Trump wasn't firing these lawyers. They were quitting. They were abandoning Trump because he was impossible to work with. But Trump's ego couldn't accept that, so Trump tried to spin it as though he was in control, as though he was making the decision. But everyone could see through it. Trump's desperate attempt to save face just made him look more pathetic, more delusional, more unable to cope with the reality that he was losing everything. That perception of Trump as delusional and out of touch contributed to his political collapse because voters don't want a president who can't accept reality, who has to pretend he's winning when he's obviously losing. Trump's courtroom outburst became evidence of exactly that delusion. The courtroom chaos and lawyer withdrawal happened at a moment when Trump was already incredibly vulnerable. This was happening right as Trump was dealing with multiple other crises: asset seizures, evidence releases, political rebellions, and the lawyer situation added to the sense that everything was falling apart simultaneously, that Trump was losing control on every front. That cascading failure was what ultimately destroyed Trump, because each crisis made the others worse. The lawyer withdrawal made Trump's legal cases harder to defend, which made asset seizures more likely, which made Trump more desperate, which led to more outbursts, which cost him more political support. It was a death spiral, and the January 3rd courtroom scene was one more loop in that spiral. The judge's comments during this hearing are also relevant to understanding the impeachment angle. According to reports, the judge made comments during the proceedings that suggested Trump's conduct might rise to the level of impeachable offenses. Specifically, the judge noted that Trump was violating court orders while serving as president, and that a president who refuses to comply with lawful court orders is arguably violating his oath of office. The judge suggested that such conduct might warrant congressional action. Now, the judge couldn't impeach Trump. Only Congress can do that. But the judge's comments were interpreted as signaling that Trump's behavior was so egregious that impeachment might be appropriate. Those comments fueled speculation that if Democrats retook the House in the 2026 midterms, they would immediately move to impeach Trump. Trump was clearly terrified of that possibility because Trump had said publicly just days earlier that if Republicans lost the House, he would be impeached. Trump knew that his conduct provided ample grounds for impeachment and that only Republican control of the House was protecting him. The judge's comments seem to validate Trump's fears. Let's talk about what it means when lawyers withdraw from a case mid-trial or mid-proceeding. Courts generally don't like it because it delays proceedings, creates complications, and potentially denies clients their right to representation. Judges usually deny withdrawal motions unless there are very serious reasons. The reasons Epstein and Blanche gave were serious. Inability to effectively represent the client due to client misconduct. That's one of the few grounds that judges reliably accept for mid-case withdrawal, but it requires the lawyers to essentially admit their client is impossible to work with. That admission damages the client's case going forward because future judges know that the client caused previous lawyers to quit. That makes judges less sympathetic, less likely to grant extensions or accommodations, more likely to assume the client is at fault when problems arise. Trump's lawyer withdrawal created a snowball effect, made all of Trump's future legal proceedings more difficult, made judges more skeptical of Trump's claims, and made it harder for Trump to find competent replacement counsel. The specific moment when Trump yelled, "You're fired," has special significance. That phrase was Trump's catchphrase from The Apprentice, the reality show that made Trump a household name. Trump had used that phrase throughout his career to project power, to show he was in control, that he made the decisions. But using it in this context, when his lawyers were actually quitting, showed how desperately Trump was clinging to his image. He couldn't admit weakness, couldn't accept that his lawyers were abandoning him. So, he tried to reframe it as his decision, but it didn't work because everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. They knew the lawyers had filed the withdrawal motion first. They knew they were quitting because Trump was impossible. Trump's "you're fired" just sounded sad, desperate, like a man trying to pretend he still had power when everyone could see he didn't. That moment became symbolic, became a metaphor for Trump's entire collapse. Trump pretending to be in control while everything fell apart around him. What does this January 3rd courtroom disaster tell us about Trump's situation and his ultimate fate? First, it proved Trump was his own worst enemy. His lawyers weren't incompetent. They weren't disloyal. They were trying to defend him, but Trump wouldn't let them. He kept sabotaging his own defense, making incriminating statements, violating court orders, having outbursts. That self-destructive pattern extended beyond this one case. Trump did it in every legal proceeding, every business dealing, every political situation. He couldn't help himself, couldn't control his impulses. And that lack of control destroyed him, because you can't win in court if you keep admitting guilt. Can't maintain political support if you keep having public meltdowns. Trump's inability to exercise basic self-control was a fundamental flaw that contributed to every one of his failures. The lawyer withdrawal accelerated Trump's legal collapse. Without Epstein and Blanche, Trump's legal defense became significantly weaker. He had to scramble to find replacement lawyers, and the lawyers willing to take Trump's cases were less experienced, less skilled, and in some cases, less ethical. Those weaker lawyers lost motions Trump might have won with better representation. They failed to raise objections that could have protected Trump. They made mistakes that cost Trump in settlement negotiations and trial outcomes. By the time Trump faced his most serious charges, war crimes, and comprehensive RICO indictments, his legal team was a shadow of what it had been. That weaker team couldn't mount an effective defense, and Trump got convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The January 3rd lawyer withdrawal was the beginning of that cascade. The courtroom scene provided video evidence of Trump's mental state and character. The footage of Trump yelling at his lawyers was played repeatedly on news programs, was shared millions of times on social media, and it showed Americans exactly who Trump was. Uncontrolled, abusive, delusional, unable to accept responsibility. That video evidence shaped public opinion, made people who had defended Trump start to question their support, made moderates who had given Trump chances decide he was unfit, and contributed to Trump's political weakening, which made it easier for prosecutors to charge him, easier for courts to impose harsh sentences, because there was less political cost when public opinion had already turned against Trump. Trump's fear of impeachment proved justified. He was right that if Democrats retook the House in 2026, he would be impeached. And that's exactly what happened. Democrats won the House in November 2026, partly because Republicans were so divided and chaotic, partly because Trump's scandals had exhausted voters. In January 2027, the new Democratic House immediately began impeachment proceedings, charging Trump with abuse of power, obstruction of justice, war crimes, everything. While the Senate didn't convict because it required a 2/3 vote, the impeachment proceedings produced evidence that was later used in criminal trials. The lawyer withdrawal on January 3, 2026, was one step in a chain that led to impeachment, which led to criminal charges, which led to Trump's conviction and imprisonment. The judge's comments about impeachment-worthy conduct created precedent for holding Trump accountable. When a federal judge says on the record that a president's conduct might warrant impeachment, that's significant. It's a judge identifying what they believe is a serious violation, and other judges can cite that. Prosecutors can reference it, and it becomes part of the legal and political discourse. The judge's comments validated concerns about Trump, made it easier for Congress to justify impeachment, made it easier for prosecutors to argue Trump had engaged in a pattern of violating laws and oaths. That validation mattered because it showed Trump's conduct wasn't just politically controversial, it was legally problematic. And that distinction helped build the case for comprehensive accountability. Trump's inability to maintain relationships with his own lawyers paralleled his inability to maintain relationships with anyone. He burned through lawyers like he burned through staff, through political allies, through business partners, through everyone. Because Trump treated people as disposable, as tools to be used and discarded. And eventually, people got tired of it. Got tired of being abused, got tired of being blamed when Trump's schemes failed, and they left. Trump ended up isolated, surrounded only by the most desperate or deluded supporters. That isolation made Trump vulnerable, made it easier for prosecutors to flip witnesses, easier for investigators to find people willing to testify against Trump. The lawyer withdrawal was emblematic of that broader pattern, and that pattern contributed directly to Trump's downfall. The January 3rd courtroom chaos showed that Trump had learned nothing from his previous failures. He had been through multiple impeachments, multiple criminal trials, multiple business bankruptcies, and in every case, his own conduct had made things worse. His inability to control himself, to listen to advice, to behave appropriately, it was always the same pattern. But Trump never learned, never changed. Even as his world collapsed around him, Trump kept making the same mistakes, kept having the same outbursts, kept alienating the people trying to help him. That inability to learn, to grow, to adapt, that's what ultimately destroyed Trump. Because people who can't learn from mistakes keep making them, and eventually the consequences become inescapable. For Trump, those consequences meant prison. So, where does this leave us? On January 3rd, 2026, Trump's lead attorneys filed emergency motions to withdraw from representing him. They said in open court that Trump was impossible to work with, that he wouldn't follow legal advice, that he made statements undermining his own defense. Trump's reaction was to yell, "You're fired," trying to pretend he was in control when everyone could see his lawyers were quitting. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The scene was captured on video and went viral, becoming one more piece of evidence that Trump was falling apart. The lawyer withdrawal left Trump with weaker legal representation, made his cases harder to defend, and contributed to the cascade of legal defeats that followed. The judge's comments about impeachment-worthy conduct validated concerns about Trump, encouraged Congress to move forward with accountability, and provided precedent for prosecutions. Trump's "you're fired" moment became symbolic, showing Trump desperately clinging to an image of power while losing everything. Trump's final months were defined by self-destruction lawyers quitting assets seized, political support collapsing, culminating in his January 3rd courtroom disaster. His inability to control himself, accept reality, or ask for help left him alone, convicted, imprisoned, and defeated.